The Intel i7-2600K is arguably one of the most iconic products released by Intel in the last decade, following up the seminal Nehalem CPUs with major architectural improvements in the second-generation Core i series Sandy Bridge CPUs. The 2600K was a soldered CPU with significant performance uplift over Nehalem 930s and launched when AMD's Phenom 2 X6 CPUs were already embattled with the previous Intel architecture. We revisited these CPUs last year, but we wanted to come back around to the 2600K in 2018 to see if it's finally time to upgrade for hangers-on to the once king CPU. Before that, this video is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly and their high-end thermal compounds. Thermal Grizzly makes cryonaut paste for high thermal performance and conductivity without being electrically conductive, so you don't have to worry about shorting components. Cryonaut is particularly good for replacing stock GPU pastes, as Cryonaut is a non-curing compound. Learn more at the link in the description below. Sandy Bridge marked the last massive uplift in performance if you look at processors core to core. It's a bit different now, because now we have things like the 9900K, where it's a core count increase alongside frequency bumps. But speaking strictly to core-to-core comparisons, Sandy Bridge really posted big gains, even over Nehalem, which was already a pretty big improvement over the Q6600 and Q9000 series quad-core CPUs. So Sandy Bridge rightfully has a fond place in the industry for a lot of enthusiasts who likely got their start on the 2600K, 2500K, or similar parts. The 2700K is in there as well. It was a refresh of the 2600K. It's about 100 megahertz faster, but we're looking at the original today, the 2600K, and the launch date, depending on how you line it up, they were manufactured around 2009, 2010 for the CPUs. So it's going on almost a decade at this point. It's about 8 years old, depending on when you bought your Sandy Bridge CPU. So the 2600K, it's still a damn good chip, but there's a lot of stuff out there now. It's been a good year for CPUs from Intel and AMD. You've got Ryzen 2000 series, Intel 9000 series, 8000 series. So we're going to bench it against all that stuff and see where the 2600K stands today, even with overclocking, because we can push hours to about 4.7 gigahertz, which is pretty damn good for those CPUs, and that really changes things up in the stack. And as noted, we did this previously, not too long ago actually, but things have changed a lot in the CPU market in the last couple of months. So if you're new here, the article below and the link in the description will include testing methodology information that'll help you get a firm understanding of what parts we're using to test. It also talks about things like what are 1% lows and 0.1% lows, and how are they sometimes flawed, because that's a metric that we use for some of the benchmarks, and you may not be familiar with it. We choose games specifically as representations for the engines and APIs that those games run. So we focus on testing, for example, one Ego engine game to cover all of Codemasters, or we focus on testing maybe one popular DX12 title, a couple of popular DX11 titles, things like that. And you'll see through the list as we get through it how each one can represent its engine and API, because if you have one firm representation of that engine, that API, you can pretty much extrapolate the performance differences across most of the games that use similar engines and APIs. So that's how we do our test, and we'll have more information in the article if you're new here. Otherwise, let's get into it for the 2600K revisit of 2018. F1 2018 is up first. Using the Ego engine by Codemasters, F1 2018 offers a strong representation of some of the most common racing games available. This one tends to push extremely high frame rates, even at 4K resolutions in our GPU benchmarks. But this is a CPU benchmark, so we'll start with 1080p. For 1080p and high settings, we tracked F1 2018 as hitting 165 FPS average on the i7-2600K stock CPU, putting the once king i7-2600K about on par with the Ryzen 3 1200 CPU overclocked to 3.9 gigahertz. It's performing behind the R5 1600 stock CPU as well, although we must give credit to the 2600K for keeping up for as long as it has. It's been 8 years now. It's still perfectly capable in this particular title, although it may be limiting for anyone who can see the difference at 200 Hz. Generationally, the 4790K ends up at 218 FPS average, giving us an interesting mark for comparison, and that's a large gain over the 2600K. Although both are quite old, the 2600K is significantly older. If you want to use percentages in this nonlinear metric of frame rate, that'd be a 32% gain. In terms of frame time differences, you're still looking at roughly 4.6 milliseconds frame to frame interval for the 4790K, or about 6.1 milliseconds on the 2600K. Normalizing for this, the increase is still about 31.5% improved. The 8700K ends up at 248 FPS average when stock, for reference, with the 9900K stock CPU at 284 FPS average. These deviate from core count equivalents with the 2600K, but the 8700K does replace its position in spirit. Overclocking the 2600K to 4.7 GHz really helps its positioning, planting it firmly alongside the 4.2 GHz overclocked R5-2600 and the 3.9 GHz overclocked R7 1700 8-core CPU. It has also closed in on the stock 4790K, overall proving an impressive chip even in 2018. Let's look at some frame time numbers from F1 2018 at 1080p. This frame time plot will demonstrate frame-to-frame intervals in milliseconds between the i7-2600K stock and overclocked alongside the 2700 stock and overclocked. Remember, these charts are ultimately the most important, not FPS charts. FPS charts are also important and hard to beat for comparing a large amount of devices simultaneously, but frame times illustrate real gameplay experience from one frame to the next. Lower is better, but more consistent is better than lower. For perspective, 16.667 milliseconds is 60 FPS, which you get by dividing 1000 milliseconds by 60 FPS. On-present frame time represents the interval of time between frames being shown to you. In these results, we can see some frame time spikes that are just the nature of F1 2018. These happen sometimes and are why our 0.1% low metrics are all over the place for this game. No one CPU has a statistically significant amount more spikes than others. It just appears to be native to the engine. Overall, we see that the 2600K at 4.7 GHz and R7-2700 at 4.2 GHz do the best, but all of these remain clustered around 4 to 6 millisecond frame times, which is overall excellent performance, mind you. Most players would be happy with either device. For perspective, here's one of those plots with the i9-9900K versus the 2600K. In this one, the 9900 sits closer to 4 millisecond frame times on average, ranging between 3.8 and 4.5, with the 2600K sticking closer to a range of 6.6 to 8.4 milliseconds when stock. As for whether you can notice that difference, well, that's up to you. But the 9900K is obviously significantly better in overall performance than 2010's 2600K, and that also shouldn't surprise anyone. At 1440p, back to FPS charts, the 2600K keeps identical positioning as previously. This makes sense, because we're becoming GPU bound at the top end, while CPU load remains the same. Even at 1440p and with the GPU truncating the max frame rate, there is still a significant improvement at the top end of performance with newer Intel CPUs. A hard line is drawn at the 4790K in this benchmark, where no AMD CPU has managed to cross just yet. That said, the 2700 is awfully close, and one has to evaluate whether other workloads may shift the CPU choice in favor of AMD's lineup. That's, again, up to you. It just depends on what you're doing. If you're only playing F1, the stack is clearly in favor of higher frequencies from Intel. Let's look at another game for more perspective. Assassin's Creed Origins is up next, giving us a look at a Ubisoft title with a commonly modified engine for other Ubisoft games. At 1080p medium, ACO lands the 2600K stock CPU at 63 FPS average, with lows at 43 FPS 1% and 35 FPS 0.1%. This game is a bit more consistent than some of the others we've tested, and so the low values prove more useful here for rapid indications of frame time consistency. That's what these are. If you're not familiar, the 1% and 0.1% lows are indicators for the worst frame times as converted to FPS without looking at an outlier of minimums. The 2600K stock numbers mark it as a bit better than the overclocked 3.9 GHz R3-1200 in average FPS. Although measurable, we should also note that this difference is imperceptible to any real user. The low frame time performance delta is within margin of error between them as well. Overclocking the 2600K pushes it up to 76 FPS average, ranking it between the modern R5-1600 stock CPU and the stock 2600K. Performance here becomes limited rapidly, as evidenced by our maximum frame rate of about 135 to 138 FPS average. Even the modern i5-8400 is outperforming the 2600K in big ways, ranking 92 FPS average with the 6-core, 6-thread configuration. It's 2 fewer threads, but the upgrades to cache and architecture as a whole have benefited the 8400 noticeably, as has its frequency and turbo boost changes. The stock 8700K offers 113 FPS average, roughly an 80% improvement over the stock 2600K. The R7-2700 ends up at about 45% higher in FPS when both are stock. At this point, nearly anything would be an upgrade to this 2600K. It'd be hard to be upset, really, with a modern i7 or R7 CPU when considering these results. Whether you go i7, R7, i9, or otherwise will depend on budget and on other use cases, like those exiting gaming. We'll talk about that more in the conclusion and in the Blender results. At 1440p, the 2600K ends up in roughly the same exact positioning. This makes sense because we're not hitting a GPU stressor at these performance levels. Nothing really changes about the stack once at 1440p, at least nothing aside from the chart-topping CPUs where the 2080 Ti actually becomes a limitation. Far Cry 5 is up next using the Dunya engine by Ubisoft. We recently explained that this game has some frame time consistency issues on Intel CPUs with fewer than 8 threads, or at least maybe a cache difference, we're still researching it, making Far Cry one of the best examples of why 1% and 0.1% load numbers don't always show the full story. This is a known flaw in any FPS reporting, and that's why we showed this frame time plot in the 9600K review, illustrating that occasional severe spikes can get averaged out when using even a 0.1% low average. And these spikes, although there aren't many of them, are noticeable. They freeze for 100 milliseconds at a time in some cases. This has nothing to do, by the way, with overclock stability, as is made obvious by frame time plots and also by 1440p testing. It's entirely to do with consistency of frame delivery on i5 CPUs where we get sporadic frame-to-frame intervals. We're still looking into this further. Anyway, for a normal FPS chart, the i7-2600K lands at around 82 FPS average. This ranks the 8-year-old flagship CPU as roughly tied with an R3 1200, which is about $100 to $115 in 2018. Overclocking the 2600K boosts it to 102 FPS average, a significant uplift of about 26%. This performance figure ties the 2600K with the R7 2700 stock CPU, even in frame time consistency. There is no objective improvement to, quote, smoothness between the 2700 and the overclocked 2600K. Overclocking the 2700 does provide further uplift, of course, as does an 8700K or similar. 1440p, by the way, helps further illustrate that Far Cry 5 frame time consistency is deeper than just overclocking, as averaging yielded equally bad 0.1% low metrics on the 9600K stock and overclocked for this round of tests. That doesn't matter here though. The 2600K ends up again at around 81 FPS average, which is completely expected since we're not GPU bound. Civilization 6 provides an important benchmark for CPUs, giving us a look at turn resolution time requirements. In grand campaign style games where AI players have to think about their actions, considering thousands of options, the CPU rapidly becomes the bottleneck as the GPU spins its wheels waiting for the occasional frame to come through. In this instance, turn time requirements on the stock i7-2600K are 15.7 seconds per turn, which is calculated against 5 AI players and averaged across multiple test passes. This means that for a full rotation back to your own turn after clicking end turn, you'd be waiting about 78.5 seconds on the 2600K. For perspective, a modern 9900K stock CPU requires 11.7 seconds to process a turn, meaning that the full rotation takes 58.5 seconds. Considering that turn time goes up as campaigns drag on, this delta rapidly becomes significant for turn-based strategy enthusiasts. The 8700K also does well at 12.5 seconds stock, and overclocking the 2600K to 4.7 GHz provides a significant turn time requirement reduction of 14%, putting it alongside the i5-8400 stock CPU and R5-2600 stock CPU. This game particularly likes frequency, which is why you'll see the Ryzen CPUs with a higher clock outperforming their higher thread counterparts from the Ryzen families. Blender offers a look at realistic non-gaming workloads that a 3D artist might encounter. We used Blender to make our 2-second intro animation before this video that you likely saw, and we also used one of the frames from that animation to benchmark CPU performance. We made a couple of additional frames too, like our monkey head render test, just stress testing different workloads. With the GN logo render as the primary benchmark, the stock i7-2600K requires 90 minutes to complete the render. For perspective, the 2990WX 32-core AMD CPU requires 9.5 minutes for that same render. We move the decimal a whole point to the left in that comparison, pretty remarkable differences. And in that same render, the more price-consistent stock 8700K requires about 33 minutes to complete the render. No matter how you look at it, every other CPU on the chart would be an upgrade. Overclocking the 2600K to 4.7 GHz pushed it to 67 minutes, a massive and noticeable render time reduction of 25%. This puts it closer to the 4790K, but still distant. as the 4790K reduces its render time over the overclocked 2600K still by 18%. This application is primarily where AMD's offerings really start to shine. The R7-2700 completes the GN logo in about 32 minutes when stock, which reduces render time against the stock 2600K by 64%. Overclocking to 4.2 GHz pushes it even lower, down to 27 minutes render time. If 3D rendering or tile-based rendering applications are your thing, it would be worth looking into Ryzen as a high-performance part that comes in at a relatively low price. This doesn't apply globally to all productivity applications, mind you. Photoshop still really favors frequency, as does Premiere, both made by Adobe, but Ryzen does it very well with tile-based rendering and 3D rendering, like in this benchmark. Closing this one out, then, it's still a really good CPU. I mean, the 2600K, you really have no reason to feel bad about still using it, because for pure gaming, in a lot of those games, F1's a great example, there's really nothing wrong with its performance. Now, if you put a 2080 Ti in there, or even a 1080 Ti in a lot of instances, yes, the card will be bottlenecked by the GPU. But for a lot of these games that are really more intensive on a single thread, or maybe two threads, the 2600K still does just fine once it's overclocked to modern frequency standards. And 4.6, 4.7 gigahertz isn't too hard to achieve with a decent cooling solution and maybe 1.35 volts or something around there. So it still does really well. As always, when it comes to upgrading, you just have to ask yourself, am I happy with the current system I have? Is it holding me back? If the answer is, yes, I'm happy with it, no, it's not meaningfully holding me back, then keep using it. But one of the best things you can do if you're not ready to upgrade, either because you just really like the build, you don't have the money for it, something like that, you're not happy with the current part selection on the market, then one of the best things you can do to bring a 2600K back to life, or any CPU that's dated, is to just do a clean install of Windows, completely fresh, start over. Put an SSD in there, make sure it's wiped clean, install a fresh OS, get all the drivers installed. You'll be impressed with how much performance you can claw back, because if you've been using the 2600K since it came out, that's a long time. First of all, it's an older version of Windows, but that's a long time for Windows to just get cluttered with stuff that slows down the whole experience, even when you're launching games. So one of the best things we can recommend is a clean install if you're not ready to migrate just yet, and that's something that people often overlook when they think about benchmarks, because your frame rate is probably a hell of a lot lower than it could be if you're running on a build from 2010 for the software. But if you are ready to upgrade, clearly in the gaming department there are plenty of options from Intel. AMD does pretty well there these days as well, with the R7-2700, for example, and pricing is good for AMD. But if you want just pure gaming, Intel's doing well at the top half of most of these charts. If you want something with a mixed workload capability that is stronger in things like 3D rendering performance, maybe you do some 3D modeling, then AMD is an excellent choice to consider. The second generation, second-ish generation, it's a Zen Plus process. Second-ish generation of Ryzen 2000, it carries important updates for BIOS that improves stability, improved memory timings, all that kind of stuff. So if you've been wanting to move to a new processor, but you were hesitant about the first gen Ryzen launch, just know that with the new motherboards that have come out, with all the BIOS updates, it's significantly improved. And it's a very competitive and compelling product now, especially the R7-2700 or the R5-2600. Now, that said, that's kind of a lateral move for gaming performance in a lot of these games that we demonstrated today. So if you're just gaming, you're not really going to get much of a meaningful performance uplift with that kind of migration. You would have to go 8700K, maybe 9900K, but the price jump there is it's massive. A 9900K, if you can even find one, is functionally an HEDT priced product. It's a 7900X in price. So we hesitate on that recommendation, but if you want something that's more price equivalent to the 2600K when it launched, you can look at the 9700K, which we haven't yet tested, the 8700K, which we have tested and does very well, or if you have more money, 9900K is worth consideration. And again, just to hedge it there, if you do have some production applications that are maybe more thread intensive, like tile-based rendering, then Ryzen is an excellent choice to consider for those kinds of workloads as well. So totally depends on what you're doing. The CPU market has a lot of choices these days where it's a great opportunity to select almost entirely based on your specific use case. There's no longer a case where it's just like, this Intel CPU is the best, period, because now there are different options in different price categories now that AMD has entered the market in a stronger position than it was previously able to. So hopefully that helps you out. As always, look at the charts, form your own opinions on what you need. But hopefully that gives you some guidance on how you can move for the 2600K. If you're still running it, consider overclocking it, put a new cooler on it, something like that, and reinstall Windows, and you might be happy with it for another year or so. Subscribe for more as always. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to help us out directly, or patreon.com/gamersnexus, and we'll see you all next time.